Hey guys, I'm here with a new video today all about how I prep and set up my watercolor palette, plus 3 common mistakes I see new artists making and how you can avoid them. So I'm going to be using all Winsor & Newton professional watercolors as I set up this palette. This will work for whatever colors you want to use to set up your watercolor palette. Okay, so the first mistake to avoid is not prepping the watercolor palette. Whenever you get a new plastic or metal watercolor palette, you'll probably find that it has this shiny surface that just doesn't work well for mixing up your watercolor wash. You can fix this by using a mild abrasive on the palette. I always start with rubbing alcohol and a dish sponge, and that usually works, but if your palette needs something with a bit more grit to it, you can use another mildly abrasive cleaner. Once your palette has a bit more texture in the mixing wells, it will be easier to make your color mixes and to get a nice wash of color. The second mistake is not filling your palette all the way to the corners. I use a toothpick to spread the paint evenly all the way up to the corners. This way, as the paint dries out, it is less likely to shrink up and crack so much that it falls out of the palette easily. Plus, when you're filling your pans or wells like this, it makes it much easier to use your brush. If you avoid stabbing your brush down straight into the paint and instead pick up your color with the brush at a nice gentle angle, you can stretch out the lifespan of your brushes. Third mistake is not using color charts. You can get really fancy with color charts, and I love them for practicing color mixing and color theory, but don't forget to make a simple color chart key for how you set up your palette. I like to make mine to match the palette setup, and I cut it down to size to fit into the palette. Once I finish my chart, it's easy to laminate it and carry it with me as a reference. And it's also really helpful when it's time to refill my colors, so that I know I am refilling by using the same color. Don't forget to always include the brand when you're making a color chart, since colors can vary between brands depending on what pigments they use. So those are the 3 mistakes and how to avoid them. The next part of the video is going to be all about how I set up my most recent palette. My general game plan for this palette is to line up my warm colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, along the right-hand side of the palette, my cool colors, mostly blues and greens, in the corner, and earth tones along the left-hand side. For most of my colors, I'm trying to use both a warm tone and a cool tone version to give me lots of choices when it comes to color mixing and options to create contrast between warm and cool tones. For example, as I'm lining up my reds, I'm going to include both permanent rose, a cool toned red, and a cadmium red, a warm toned red. I'm just giving myself more options since I am already using a big palette here with 28 wells, and I have lots of room for mixing, so I'm just going to give myself a wide range of colors that I can mix. So there are a few things I want to point out while I'm filling my watercolor palette. The first is that this is a folding watercolor palette, so if you are using watercolor paints like Sennelier that use honey in their tubes of watercolor paint, you'll want to only fill your pans on one side. The reason is paints that include honey like that don't dry out the same way that these Winsor & Newton ones do, so they are best stored flat so that they don't run everywhere. Another thing I am keeping in mind as I fill my pans is how much paint I am using. If I keep a color about halfway filled, I'll have room in the individual wells to get a clean wash of one color if I don't want to mix it up in the mixing wells. I also know that there are some colors I just don't use as much, so I might put a little less paint out in that well in case I want to change it up later. Alright, the rest of this video is going to be me filling the watercolor pans and showing you each and every color that I used to do it, since if you're like me, you really like that level of detail. I hope you found these tips and the walkthrough helpful or interesting. If you have any tips for palette prep, I'd love to hear them in the comments so I can try out new things. If you liked this video and want to see more like this, please like and subscribe.